Bruce Bell needs no introduction. Everybody recognizes Mr. Bruce Bell. Am I close to Mr. Bell?
Oh, sure.
Everybody knows you in Toronto.
Yes, well, especially here at St. Lawrence Market, where we are right now, where I'm the official historian of the market. It's over 200 years old, and a lot of history. And also, I do all the tours here. I do all the food tasting tours and history tours and school tours. So I'm here every day. And I also write for a local newspaper here in the neighborhood. So people who come into the market and see me, they go, oh, there's that guy who writes that history column I read. And, oh yeah, I've taken a tour with him. And he's leading another tour. So I'm here all the time.
So you see this place every day. Is there a specific place that you like to visit most here in this market?
Well, I love food, and whatever food is in season, and this is an everyday market. St. Lawrence Market is made up of two markets. There's this one here, which is open every day, and then there's the one across the street, which is the farmer's market. And that is really the gem, I feel, of Toronto, is St. Lawrence Farmer's Market. For over 200 years, farmers have been coming to sell their goods. And when you think 200 years ago here in Canada, especially where we are in Toronto, we were in the middle of nowhere. We were this colonial outpost of the British Empire. And to have any sort of food back then, you were really lucky. So the farmers knew this. They knew to start, let's give people what they want when we can. I mean, there were some winters when there was very little to eat, but they made the most of it. And luckily, the first pioneers that came here, those English and Americans, had the help of Canada's First Nations, the Mohawks and the Hurons, to teach them how to get through these, horrendous winters that we had. So this is all contained here, that vast history of Canada's first people, the French, the Americans, the British that came here, and eventually us, the people who were born here, us who came to live here, all benefit from those early farmers that started bringing their first foods here.
You brought a few materials, and they're actually waiting for us.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to follow you to the field.
All right. You
It's
do
very
that.
noisy in here.
Well, come with me. We are in the Market Kitchen, which is the event place of St. Lawrence Market. But you will notice too, as you were panning around, that brick wall there. That's what's left of the old City Hall of Toronto. The market was actually built over top of the old City Hall. That brick wall is, dates back to 1844, and that was what remains of the old City Hall of Toronto. There's still the gallery is upstairs. The old council chamber is it's in use as a gallery, and in the sub-basement is an old jail. So this was built right on the water, and you can see, Front Street here. Now this is the old downtown of Toronto, the old, commercial center of the city, which has now become, quite trendy. But for the longest time, after they started building all the skyscrapers, everything moved from this area here to where you see all those big, beautiful buildings, and this area became really run down. And it's only been in the last 30 years that it started to really bring itself back up again and become a real great neighborhood to live in.
You are the official guide of St. Lawrence Market and several historical sites
Yes.
in Toronto.
Yes.
What makes you so attached to this place? You seem to be more attached to St. Lawrence Market.
Well, I think when I first moved to Toronto, 40 years ago, I came and discovered the market. And back then, 40 years ago, it wasn't as upscale as it is today. I think it was used mostly as a place where other stores would come to buy their fruits and vegetables to sell. It wasn't really that nice of a place, but there was something about it that really intrigued me. I said, this is really something. And I just started looking around and reading up on it and learning about this neighborhood here where I live now. I didn't back then when I first moved here, but this is where Toronto was founded, on this very spot where we are right now. That's always intrigued me so much, that this great city of 7 million people grew from this tiny spot 200 years ago.
And the materials that you brought here, I believe they speak about this and also about you as...
Yes, for many years I've been writing for a newspaper called The Bulletin. This paper here, which is the paper for people who live in downtown Toronto. And I'm always on page 3. This is actually me and David Crombie, who was the mayor of Toronto when I moved here in the 1970s. And he's become a good friend of mine. And this particular article, which came out 2 months ago, is celebrated my 40th year in Toronto. But I'm also I'm the historian of the Royal York Hotel, which is one of the largest hotels in Canada. And I do a lot of tours there also. I love that hotel. It's where I had my first job. And the hotel, I give guided tours of that great hotel that was built in 1929.
Do you know how many people you have kind of led in tours?
Well, during the height of tourist season, from like May till maybe October, I could do maybe 100 people a week. So I mean, it really is quite, it's become very intense sometimes.
So over your career, it's probably thousands and thousands.
Oh, for sure. And I remember every single one of them. And here's actually a picture. This is a little article that was me in a Buffalo newspaper. And that's me downstairs in the jail, telling people about how the market is more than just food. It's also, again, the history of Canada. And there I am standing in the market. There's the City Hall, which is right behind us.
You probably became one with this city.
Oh, very much so. I mean, I'm very aware. There's St. Lawrence Hall, that beautiful building with the green dome. I also do tours in there. That's actually connected to St. Lawrence Market. And the building with the mural on it, that's the Farmers Market.
They have subterranean pathways or tunnels?
No, and I'm always surprised that I have never found one. I think there might have been back in the day, but I've never found. I think they're planning on building one underneath the street. But that hall very much is the very center of Canadian history. A lot of the founding fathers of Canada, the fathers of Confederation, used to meet there and speak. It was built in 1850 it opened. So it's been around for a long time, and over here, that beautiful building with the green roof, the Gooderham building. I mean, that's was once still is a very fashionable place to have your office, but that was Mr. Gooderham's office. He was one of the wealthiest men in Ontario. He made a fortune in making whiskey at his distillery, which is still around today, the Gooderham and Wards Distillery. But as you see, it's standing all by itself. Toronto really tore down its history, and they tore down over 25,000 buildings in the 1960s and 70s to build a very clean, modern city. But they lost all that history. There's only pockets of it now. And that's what I like to do. I like to, find what's underneath those parking lots and those empty lots, what used to be.
And are people enthusiastic about learning about...
Oh, sure. And many people who live in the city take my tours. It isn't just people who are from out of town. Half the people who take my tours are people who live in Toronto, who actually live in this neighborhood where the market is. They want to learn more about who we are, where we came from. For 100 years, this area was just void of people. It was all industry during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th and early 20th century, and people just forgot about it. And then when people started moving back down here, they wanted to go, what is this place? What are these buildings? Where are we? And so I started to write about it, started to look up and started to do research and then do tours, and wrote a book on the history.
This is your book.
On the history of Toronto. All the
And there's another one coming out right now.
Yes, there's quite a few. I'm going to have hopefully quite a few of them coming out. All compilations of my newspaper articles for the last 10 years. So this is not part of the newspaper. That was a separate book altogether.
And you just mentioned that you are also a tour guide in New York.
Well, I bring people down to New York City, fly down for a weekend, and I put together these tours of New York, and I look for comparisons between New York and Toronto. New York, Toronto, and Chicago are all very, very similar cities, and Boston, Philadelphia. Anything that's an hour away, I'd love to take people, because you can just go down for 3 days.
Let's talk about your show. You have the history of Toronto.
I do.
It's sold out all the time.
Well, yes, all the time. I like to talk a lot. I like to give lectures in a fun way. And so I will rent out St. Lawrence Hall. I've done it there, or the Winter Garden Theatre, or nightclubs in the city. Anywhere that can hold people and has a stage. I mean, it's all I really need is a stage. And I'll just talk for 2 hours. I just begin at the beginning. And every show is different. I might pick, talk about the building of the great banks, how the banking came to be, how at one time people didn't trust banks. Can you imagine that? People didn't trust banks, and banks were like people's homes. They were just small little places, and then they realized, and the banking realized, that we started to build like palaces, people will start to trust us. And that's what Toronto did. They started to build these magnificent, huge, beautiful palaces. They called them banks. And Toronto was dominated, and still is, by these massive bank towers. Or I'll do the history of theater, how theater started right here, actually across the street. The first play was performed in a little hotel that stood around the old Market Square there. And back in about 1820. And I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the history of theater and how Toronto has become a world leader in theater. Much like New York and London and Toronto.
You are actually a former actor.
I was an actor since I was a kid, through my teenage years, and as much as I enjoyed it, very much, it's a hard life if you haven't really made it. And as I was getting older, every day you're having to convince people of your talent, and that was getting to me. And in the back of my mind, I just always wanted to do this, what I'm doing now. And I said, well, let's see if we can do it. Let's see. I approached the market. The market approached me and said, would you like to run tours through here? And it was about 10 years ago now. So that's how it all started.
You came a long way from the boy who was born in Sudbury, Ontario, and now
Yes.
you are a big shot in
Oh,
Toronto.
sure. Big shot. But I always loved history. Even when I was a kid in Sudbury, growing up, I always had this. My father loved history. My mother loves history. It was just always ingrained in us that almost it's in your genes that certain people are drawn to mathematics and spelling. I was drawn to history, and to actually make a living at it is a great honor. To tell the stories of the people who came before us.
Mr. Bell, how can the viewers find you?
Very easy. On the internet. I don't know how people did business before the internet, but it's brucebelltours.ca, and quite an extensive website you can visit, and the tours that I offer, and the lectures that I'm giving, and the special tours if I'm going out of town, and learn about me, and learn about Toronto and all the other things that I do here. So brucebelltours.ca.
Thank you so much.
Oh, a pleasure.
In a few minutes, we're going on air with your radio interview at blogtalkradio.com/multiplearts. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Voya in Toronto with legendary tour guide Bruce Bell. Bruce Bell has been around for a long time. He is part of this city. He became one with this city. He has been touring people, showing people around for over 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
and he's the official guide of several historical sites in Toronto. One of them is St. Lawrence Market, where we are right now. Mr. Bell, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. And would you like to talk a little bit about the beginnings of Bruce Bell?
Well, thank you very much. I came to Toronto 40 years ago when I was a teenager. I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to become a big movie star. So I came down to Toronto. I left my home in Sudbury, and I got a small walk-on in a film, in a movie. And that began took over the next 30 years of my life. I obviously never became a big star, but I enjoyed the theater that I did, and I started to write plays also. I always figured if no one was going to, write me a part, I would write my own parts. So I started to write my own plays, I started to produce my own plays, and I made some money doing walk-ons and TV commercials, but I was never really happy. All I ever really wanted to do was just control my own destiny, to do something that I had a passion for, that was going to make me a decent living. And in the back of my head, there was always this idea that I loved history so much. How can I make a living at history? And I realized that, I was coming into my 40s and I wasn't happy. I said, well, let's stop everything. Just stop it all and let's start again. Let's start with something I love, and what I loved was history. I started selling some stories of, I live right downtown Toronto. We have a great newspaper here called The Bulletin. I started writing stories for The Bulletin of history of Toronto, the history of where St. Lawrence Market is, at the very center of Toronto. So I started every month writing these articles and doing research and loving what I was doing. And then the market approached me and said, how would you like to do tours through the market? We'll sponsor you. A lot of tourists come into St. Lawrence Market. Let's offer them something. So I started doing tours here 10 years ago. And at first it was only maybe 1, 2, 3 tours a month. It was nothing big, but it was enough to get me started. And here it is 10 years later, and now it's an everyday occurrence. And some days it could be 3 or 4 tours, happening at the same time. So it was a wonderful exposure, to come into this market. It's actually, because it's more than just food. I mean, St. Lawrence Market is where Toronto was founded 200 years ago, and that's what we have here. We've got 200 years of history, and that's just British, American, Canadian history. This also goes back to the early days of, maybe we think the First Nations, the Huron and the Mohawks, were coming here for 1,000 years before the British arrived. So we have all that great history to unravel and uncover and to get to tell people. So in Toronto, 200 years ago was a small little town of 200 people. And here it is now, 7 million people. So there's all that story, all that history, the history of architecture in the city, which as I was doing research, I would start to learn about the architecture of Toronto and how we went from living in, huts along Lake Ontario to this great granite city of steel and glass, and all the different architects that were influenced by what they saw in Europe, what they saw in Paris and Venice and Rome, and coming to Toronto in the 19th century and building that, recreating Paris and downtown Toronto. And a lot of that was destroyed, unfortunately, after the Second World War, when they decided to make Toronto a very modern, North American city. They said, let's get rid of this, the European look. 25,000 buildings were demolished during that time. So I want to know about these buildings and the people who built them, and started digging up old pictures of them and photographs and showing people, this is what we once were. This is where we came from. Not to lose sight of the past at all, to always keep that in the back of your mind, that, Toronto wasn't always this great metropolis, and we fought to get where we are.
You have come to know so much about the city, about every brick. about every stone. You seem to leave nothing unturned. There's so much curiosity, but also a longing to make sure that people do not forget.
Absolutely. We are always walking on the shoulders of the dead. There are always people before us, whether it's on the physical land that we're walking on, or our ancestors from thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. What history we do know should be treasured. The cliche is if you don't learn from history, we will keep making these mistakes over and over again, and we do keep making mistakes over and over again. But for those of us who have, I think most people, even if they live in a house, they want to know the history of the house, just on a very basic form. And I think us who live here in Toronto, and especially, of course, Canada, we are one of the great nations in the history of nationhood. Canada is one of the few countries that offers equal rights for everybody. And that's something even the United States, our cousins, can't say. That's something England can't say. Not every country in the world they might think they live in and they do, of course, live in democracies, but Canada has really gone that one step further to really look at what does it mean to live in a free society. And so, living in a great city like Toronto, this vast multicultural city from people from all over the world, where everyone is treated with equal rights. We weren't always like this. People come to this city and might say, "Oh, you're so lucky, you live here," but it wasn't always like this. Toronto was once, as prejudiced and as racist as any other backward city was 100, 150 years ago. Toronto wasn't always welcome to immigrants. It wasn't always, good with equal rights when it came to women, and people of minorities. Unless you were a white, Protestant male, you had very little going for yourself. And from that, each generation we have found people in this city who have fought against that and to get to where we are today. There were wars fought on this soil here. There were massive protests that were going on that I don't want people, and especially the young who live here in the city, to forget about that. That we did come from a place of great prejudice to get to be this great city we are today. And I often remind that to people who I see that are on my tours that might come from countries that, they might live under a dictatorship. And, I like to remind them that at one time we did too. We once chained men to prison walls and took them out publicly and hanged them in the street for daring to defy the government. We did all that too, just like a lot of countries are today. And yet we came through that. And Toronto and Canada, we fought against all that. And I want people to know that. I want people who live here and people to come here to go, this is how you become a great civilization. You have to go through all that and realize how ridiculous it all is to get to become the great country that we live in today.
What I liked about you and also respected so much about you is how candid you are. You really say the word. You do not try to embellish anything, the history. You're very almost blunt.
And it is a blunt. History is very blunt. You can't erase the past. And I think what Canada was doing for a while was trying to cover up the past, cover up this terrible, what we did to our First Nations and to especially to the Catholic Irish that were coming over during the potato famine. We treated them horrendously. But on the other side, Toronto was one of the first cities on earth to ban slavery. In 1793, we abandoned slavery. And the Underground Railroad, came up through the United States for over, 60 years. People fled the United States to come live here in Toronto. Toronto, Canada, and freedom were all the same word to a lot of those early slaves. And I always like to, stress that to a lot of the school tours that we do. Something to be really proud of is the idea that in 1793, the people here refused to have a slave market. and refused to own people. And I think, it was another 70 years before, our cousins in the States, got around to doing that. We always, Lincoln, yes, freed the slaves. He freed the American slave. Our slaves were free, I think, before he was born. So I always like to be very proud of that.
You have also been in acting before. You've been an actor, a stand-up comedian.
Yeah.
You're pretty much an entertainer.
Yes.
And although you are not on stage, the truth is everything, everywhere you go becomes a stage.
I've often thought of my apartment as a dressing room, and the city is my stage. And when I'm doing my tours, I'm very aware that the streets that we are walking on, this is my spotlight. But I love to still perform, on theaters, and I still once in a while will rent out a theater or a nightclub, and I'll do an evening of stories where I'll stand on stage and I tell stories of the city of Toronto, and that's something that I'll read from books that I've written or some articles that I've written, and I love taking questions. I love being stumped. I would say, who's got a question to stump me in the audience? I love playing that game to see just how much do I know. And I like to know what people know. I like to know what is the collective consciousness of my audience when it comes to history. What is the one thing everyone seems to know? I always like to ask, Americans on my tours, now how much do they know about Canada? I mean, what is the one thing they know? They all seem to know our Prime Minister, which is interesting. I'm happy to hear that everyone knows Stephen Harper, but very few Americans can name our first Prime Minister. And I'm always surprised, too, when our American cousins are shocked to learn that Queen Elizabeth is the head of state. I'm always very interested in that. But at the same time, I ask Canadians these same questions. I want to say, how much do you know about Canadian history? What was taught to you in school? What do you remember? And I realize that not everyone loves history. I do realize that. I understand that. I mean, not everyone can have a passion for history. But I'm always like to know what people do retain. And so I always have stock questions for Canadians. When's Canada's birthday? I mean, I want to know. And I'm always surprised when people don't know. Now, a lot of kids know that. I've always been very happy. A lot of the students that I do during school year, from grade 1 to 13 or grade 12, that they know, the vast majority know quite a bit about Canadian history. And I'm very happy to hear that. And also, too, because us live so close to the United States, we know a lot of American history. I think the vast majority of Canadians know that George Washington was the first president of the United States and that his wife's name was Martha. I think most people know that. And I know that most people know that Washington is the capital of the United States. But as far as that, I'm always very interested and very happy to hear that a lot of the students that I do know the basics of Canadian history. That it always helps when people know that. And so when I'm doing my live shows, I like to always give a little bit, of stories that I've heard. What is, rumor in history, the gossip of history, things that may not be in the history books, things that I have read between the lines. I've often found that very fascinating. And English history and how the history of England, of course, is so intertwined into the history of Canada and the United States. When Toronto was founded by the British, by the time of the War of 1812, half the people living here were either British and the other half were American-born. There was, I think, 2 people were actually born here in Canada. Everyone else came from Britain or America. And those early people that lived here, they wanted to be here. A lot of those Americans that came up from the United States, they left the United States because they did not want to live under a president. They wanted to be, loyal to the king, and they're known as the United Empire Loyalists. And I'm always fascinated with those families that are still very divided today in America, where some of their relatives still live here and some are still in the States, how very connected we are to America, who I always call our cousins to the south.
like to be a guide now compared to when you started? Is it different?
Well, I know when I started, a lot of the guides that tours that I had taken, not just here in the city, but when I had gone to other cities, were part of groups. You had to be a part of a group to be a guide. And I always wanted to offer for one person, for 10 people, for 50 people. I'm not really sure. I never really did take any tours before I started doing my own. I knew there were guides here because they had Casa Loma, for example, one of the great tourist destinations here in Toronto. They had their own guides at Casa Loma. Fort York, the old fort in Toronto, had their guides there. But I was never aware of any actual city guides, of people who actually did do what I do. There are now, even in the 10-year period since I started, there were 3 of us who started around the same time, and now there's got to be at least 30 guides now working in this city, and that's only in a 10-year period. And that's never really taken work away from me at all. Bring them on, more the merrier. If there's more guides in the city, that it's good for tourism. And if you're good at it, fine. Now, I do tours year-round. I do them. A lot of guides are maybe just help for the summer. But I do my tours year-round. Here at the market, downtown, my architectural tours, the weather has never stopped me. I will never cancel a tour.
I actually wanted to ask you if there's a season that's more abundant in tourists.
For some reason, October is the busiest month for all guides. I am packed solid, and October, for some reason, is extremely busy. The summer can be busy. Of course, a lot of tourists are in town, but a lot of tourists in the summer seem to have things already planned for themselves. There's a lot of, the open bus tours which people take. But the autumn is a very busy time, and December can be very busy also. A lot of people are coming up from the States or coming from England to shop, and they want also something else to do. And so they'll give me a call. They'll go on the internet and look for a walking tour guide. And also, too, people really think that Toronto is cold year-round. That's something that I think most Canadians have to get used to. I have had people come in July from Texas who brought winter coats. And I've always thought that. And I almost want to put that on my website to say, this is the temperature, don't worry about it. But some people were coming up from Texas to escape the heat coming into Toronto in July, which I thought was very interesting.
I would like to talk about your books. You have one book already out, and it's actually out of print or sold out. And there's another one coming out. It's a collection of articles that you have published in the past 10 years, I believe. Do you also take the pictures that are in the books?
About 5 years ago, there was an American publisher, Sterling Publishing, were looking for someone to write a book on Toronto. They had done a book on Chicago, on Washington, on Sydney, Australia, and they said, we want a book on Toronto. And they actually went on the internet and just typed in Toronto historian, and my name came up. And they contacted me, and they said, we'd like you to write a book. Pick 80 of the top historical sites in the city. Write, 500 words on each of these sites, and we'll send a photographer up and to photograph everything. Well, and they did, and beautiful hardcover book was published of the 80, all these sites that I chose here in Toronto. Beautiful, beautiful photographs, and that book sold up to 70,000, 80,000 copies, and so much so that it's now out of print. They never thought it would sell that many, but it's completely sold out. But I have put together my actual first book was the first 2 years of my newspaper columns. That's been in print now for almost 8 years. And now I'm going to be doing 10 more books are going to be published of all my articles. of the last 13 years I've been writing. So we're putting them all into 10 separate books, and hopefully that'll be 2 books a year for the next 5-6 years. And as long as the newspaper keeps going, I will have these collections of my stories that run the gamut from architecture to my last article was on the history of my barber. My barber retired this year after 50 years of barbering. I mean, and his story was so fascinating. I wanted to get it out, what he saw, in 50 years in barbering when he started at the old King Edward Hotel. He started at the same time the Beatles came through the city. The Beatles had stayed at the King Edward Hotel. And, I'd like to write about the history of churches in the city. I mean, Toronto has some beautiful, beautiful churches and synagogues and temples. I'd like to write about that. History of theater. Toronto has over 100 theaters right now. And I'd like to write about how that all started. I love writing about theater. Theater is one of the... I love the history of theater in Toronto. The history not just of what plays were put on, but the buildings themselves. We once had one of the largest theaters in the British Empire here, Shays Hippodrome, almost 5,000 seat theater that was torn down to build New City Hall, which is 1958 it was torn down. But how we went from nothing to this magnificent, huge 5,000 seat theater. And that's Toronto embraced movies, vaudeville, live theater to this day. So I like to write about that. So all this will be in my books. There'll be a book, just all my theater articles, all my hotel articles. I love writing about hotels in the city, the history of hotels, the famous people who came through our city in the early days, like Charles Dickens coming to Toronto a year before he wrote A Christmas Carol. And I often think, did he see anything here that was to inspire him when he was writing that book? So that's all going to be coming out very shortly.
You are a very approachable guide. You've been so nice to me. You never saw me, you never met me, and you accepted my invitation. You are very modest. You are a man that thousands of people know, and still you act as if you're just a regular person, and you're not.
Oh,
you're an extraordinary person. What? It must be in your genes. What makes you so, humble?
Oh, well, you're very kind to say that. Maybe if I would have done this when I was younger, I'd probably have a huge head on my shoulder. But I think all of us, when you go through life, with the ups and the downs, and I'm just so grateful that, that I get to do what I do. I'm just very grateful. I take nothing for granted. It could all end tomorrow. I hope it doesn't, but I just love what I do so much. I'm not forced to do this at all. And I look forward to tomorrow. I love waking up in the morning knowing I've got a couple of tours to look forward to. So, but I thank you. It's very kind to say that.
How can the viewers find you if they need to reach you?
If on the internet, go to my website, brucebelltours.ca. And on my website are all my tours that are listed, and what I call my history project. I put plaques up in the city where I see there's no plaque to an event that happened in our history. I raise the money, we'll stick a plaque up, and my lectures and my shows that I do, and whatever press I might get from different people. So it's brucebelltours.ca, and you can book a tour if you find yourself in Toronto.
Mr. Bell, do you think that you will ever retire?
Oh, I hope not. This is my retirement. That's how I look at it. I hope as long as I can walk or talk, maybe one day I'll be doing virtual tours, just sending someone out with the camera. But no, I hope this is, I'm so determined to keep doing this as long as I can.
For the young generation who you know, they are more interested in pop culture. They really are not paying attention to the buildings they walk by. Do you have some words of or an invitation to come and see you or to get to know the city they live in?
When I do a tour and I notice there are younger people on the tour, like their parents have dragged them out to say, you're coming on this tour with us, I do try and put history into a modern perspective. I like to talk about, 150 years ago, it wasn't obviously the music we have today. It wasn't Justin Bieber and Lady Gaga, but we had people back then who were just as influential to young people. I'll tell them stories of the great Jenny Lind, who was she was, I like to say, not like Lady Gaga, but I mean, she was as influential to young people. And I like to find things in our past that, wearing a feather in your hat was seen as, having an iPod today at one time. I mean, that's what you did. Teenagers then, teenagers now, we all wanted the same, everyone wanted just to fit in. And so I always like to really bring that forward when I notice that I do have a school tour with me, or I've got some teenagers who don't want to be on the tour, and I like to, if I can get to those kids, you tell them ghost stories too. That's always good. And the more tell them the stories of what it was like to be a kid 150 years ago. By the time you were 15, you were been working in a factory for 10 years, and you're already married with kids. By the time you were 20, you were seen as old. And I always like to stress just to let children, teenagers know now of just what life was like back then. And I'd say for the most part they enjoy it. They enjoy hearing about these stories.
Mr. Bell, we are near the end of our interview. I would like to thank you very much. I am very grateful for meeting you, and this really is probably the chance of my lifetime. I don't know. I mean, I will probably put my son and my husband, and I will join them on a tour.
I hope so.
Next time when we come to Toronto. And I wish you a very long career or retirement.
Yes, right. Work in retirement.
And everything you wish to happen, all the best for you. And to our listeners, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Liana, very much. Thank you.